Please welcome to the stage the Honorable Fred Hochberg of Meridian International and former chairman and president of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, and our esteemed panel.
Like a rock, there we go. This is going to be a little bit more like a raucous dinner party or a family dinner table conversation than perhaps a very polite panel today. Very briefly, I chaired the Export-Import Bank of the United States for 8 years under President Obama. It was a period of enormous change coming after the global financial crisis. And, but then again, I would say the last 6-7 years have even been more tumultuous in terms of the pandemic, global migration, what's going on in Ukraine and in the rest of the world. And partly we've seen a great rift between the developed world and a lot of what people refer to as the global south. So there's been also, and we've made changes in the United States as a result. There's which we will discuss a little bit here, about nearshoring or friendshoring. China has become a much more formidable competitor, and particularly in the case of Latin America, in our own hemisphere. So for the next hour, we're going to have that conversation, and we're going to keep it lively and spirited at this end. So I'm going to throw out some general questions to the panel and encourage people to just jump in. So one, just to get us juiced up here, what kind of mistakes or differences is what the U.S. is doing right now in Latin America? What could the U.S. be doing differently in Latin America in terms of economic relations and development? Anybody want to jump in first? Henrietta.
Thank you. Many years ago, the United States really helped with institution building and educational institutions in Latin America, creating INCAI and other institutions that were really terrific. And I think that we could go back to a time when we had much more exchange of students and professors. It was really an important time. We were really thinking together, acting together. There's a second one, which is the trade and investment. For those of us who have watched trade and investment for a long time in the Americas, there is a crying need. In my private life, I have a steel company, and we wanted to buy steel products from Latin America, and we were being too picky. The you know, the containers arrived with a little bit of humidity in them, and so we ended up buying from Europe and from Asia. When I was at USAID and at UNICEF, we were thinking about vaccines, and we got better bids out of India. So we went there. We were not thinking as a hemisphere, and I think that part of it, Fred, is that we just need to think as a hemisphere, what we can be doing together.
Great. I think Jeremy wanted to jump in.
Well, I was just going to say more. I mean, it's very visible. I think you can tell from my accent, possibly, that I am gate.
You have a Texan accent.
I'm gate. It's the hat. I'm gate crashing this Americas. I come from an organisation, Canning House. We're the main forum in London for UK Latin American relations, and it's great to be here at an Americas event. But I think it's conspicuous that the wider West, of which the US is the obvious leader, is in decreasing levels of visibility across Latin America. And there is an increased void which is being filled primarily with the Chinese influence and investment. And I'm not saying countries across Latin America shouldn't be trading with countries right across the globe. The British do that, the Americans do that as well. But I think there is a leadership gap that the US is leaving behind. And that has implications because into that gap comes lots of different political opportunities for non-democratic world to step into. And you know, I mean, I'll sort of put it briefly like this. It's, you know, I think, you know, companies talk about, you know, do they sort of live by their values? In other words, not just the mission statement, it's how they treat their staff, it's how they treat their suppliers. Well, I think quite a lot of the Latin American countries, which in the last 30 or 40 years or so have embraced democracy and free civic society, free speech, you know, have a look, an event like this. There are countries around the world where it's not possible to hold events like this. And, you know, they have to, at some point, have some regard for that geopolitical balance and whether they are contributing in a positive way to making that geopolitical balance better for their people and their countries. And so it's partly, I think, about an absence of American leadership in some cases and European leadership. But I think it's also some countries in Latin America could do more themselves.
Thank you, Fred. Sure. Allow me to jump in, and I coincide both with Henrietta and Jeremy on their initial remarks, and I think that we need further economic integration with our most natural partner, which has been for years, in the case of the United States. In the case of Costa Rica, still, we have seen how our economic relationship with the United States continues to grow steadily over the years. 75% of the FDI coming into my country is US sourced, and 50% of our trade, nearly 50% of our trade is conducted with USMCA partners. That's why also Costa Rica has made a bold move to ask a request for USMCA accession. We know that in the electoral period, that's quite a challenge, but usually we do have, Costa Ricans are known for having a hard time taking no for an answers, and same thing happened when we sought OECD membership, and it finally happened. But I think that we need, well, yeah, I've seen, we've seen some positive gestures in Washington. America's Active is one of them. It's a bipartisan, from both houses, initiative that finally is a piece of legislation that has finally been introduced in Congress, which, among other things, seeks further economic integration with the United States and Latin America and the Caribbean, and opens the door for potential USMCA enlargement. We'll have to see how this evolves. This discussion evolves in Washington and in the Hill over the next months to come. But also, mind you that the government of the United States, President Biden, has tabled back in the LA Summit a very important initiative called the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, which, although has no market access provisions, it does contribute to facilitating trade, digitalizing and streamlining procedures, and I think that's a very good move forward. I think it's a step in the right direction. We're starting to finally see some symptoms of Washington looking back into the region, and we welcome very much that.
Yeah, thank you, Eduardo Sanz from the Dominican Republic. And I want to follow up on what Minister Tovar from Costa Rica said. I do think that the United States has made an effort in the last couple of years to look back to our countries, but one of the main issues is we believe, and I come from an island country that does a lot of business with the U.S. We have a free trade agreement, and we also are the third largest partner of the U.S. In the Caribbean basin. We need to recognize that when things are going good. Many times from the U.S., Latin America gets, the dialogue about narcotics, the dialogue about migration, the dialogue about corruption gets most of your attention. But the dialogue about the technology innovations, about the things that we're doing good in Latin America, we've just heard from Costa Rica, we have a colleague here from Mexico, countries that function, countries that work democratically, countries that have an ideological common ground with the United States. And sometimes when the dialogue is only about the bad things, not about the good things, a lot gets left on the table. And this is something we need to push at. The madam that spoke about, when you remember Kennedy in the 60s and you thought about the institutions for democracy and the investment that was made then, those things helped Latin America a lot. And we want to look to the States. We want to look to Europe. For other reasons in the world, we share baseball, we share cultural, we share religious, we share political ideologue. But sometimes the only message we get from the States, it's about the bad things that happen in Latin America, and that needs to change.
Yes. I think that more than a mistake, it's a missing opportunity that the U.S. have to invest more in the region. The region has so much potential to be unleashed, and it will be an important player to feed and fuel the world in the next 20 years. So how can we act as one region? And what we have seen, we are a food and beverage company. We operate in 20 markets in Latin America. And our group has grown with U.S. investors in the past 25 years because they have not only provide capital, but capabilities, best practices. So I believe that there's a lot of multinationals that have not only put capital in Latin America, but have seen the potential. We saw in the previous presentation that Olivia showed low levels of productivity. And if we see these as opportunities, I think that we can move the needle as an Americas bloc and group.
I'm going to let Dorothy jump in. And partly, what does it mean by more engagement by the U.S.? What exactly does that mean? You're the right person to ask that question.
I think that's a really good question. First of all, I appreciate Minister Tovar recognizing the American Partnerships for Economic Prosperity, which is really the Biden administration leading forward on the recognition that the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, is such an important, critical trading partner. We are the largest trading partner for Latin America and the Caribbean. And so initiatives like the American Partnership are so important. We have 13 member countries. I just want here to underscore that for President Biden and this administration, this is a huge priority, has been since day one from the Summit of the Americas, which was 2 years ago in LA. And the work in our office at the Economic Bureau at the State Department, it's a focus and a topic every day. I lead the Office of Public-Private Partnerships at the State Department, and I will say that we can't do it alone, right? We also had Vice President Harris just announced in her Central America Forward initiative, which is public-private partnerships in Latin America, another $1 billion of commitments by the private sector. So which is a total of $5 billion now. So leading and recognizing that, yes, the administration and the government has to be the one to leverage and to galvanize the private sector, but we can't do it alone. Governments cannot do it alone, and so it is very important for us to create an enabling environment to bring the private sector with us, and I just would like to underscore that this is a really big priority, and we have seen some successes, but we will have to continue to work to create this opportunity to build out infrastructure, to create high-paying jobs within the region, and to the nearshoring, the infrastructure. All of these things are so important to the U.S. achieving our goals and our goals for the region as well as partners.
I think Isaac, and then this is like the family dinner table. We'll do Isaac, Olivia, and then Enrique.
Wonderful, thank you.
And briefly.
Yes, so I will do this very briefly. Countries and companies pretend that the United States and China don't want them to choose sides. Both the US government and the Chinese government want entities, individuals, countries, and companies to pick one. And what the United States needs to do is demonstrate to Latin America governments and companies that it's a better partner, both economically and politically, than Beijing is.
Great.
Well, I just talked to you for 10 minutes, but the theme of investment is extraordinarily important, and I say this not really as a policy prescription, or not at all as a policy prescription, but as a point around what the U.S. at large, private sector included, can and should think about doing. Foreign direct investment in Latin America as a whole over the past 2 years is not higher than it was in the 5 years prior to COVID. That's a problem. It's a lot higher in many parts of the world, as it's gone down in Russia and in China. It's a lot higher in North Africa. It's a lot higher in ASEAN. It's a lot higher in developing Europe, not in Latin America. And why is that? Right. So Brazil, it's gone up. Mexico, it's gone up. Not in other parts of Latin America. Quickly on trade, people have talked about this. I will say that actually, if you look country by country, the U.S. is still the largest trading partner of countries throughout Central America, down to Colombia and Ecuador. It is no longer the largest trading partner of countries in South America. That shifted over the past 25 years. What do we want that to look like going forward? And I don't know that it is a matter of picking, personally. Part of this, though, is Latin America itself trades very little among itself. And as long as that remains the case, it's very hard to see how you actually then develop industry that's ultimately, broadly, not outside of some countries that are clearly critical, accretive to U.S. and U.S. trade. So I do think there's something that the U.S. can do, companies broadly, in thinking about what role it can play in also fostering infrastructure development and the trade within intra-Latin America.
So pivoting to Enrique for a minute, I mean, Mexico provides a lot of value-add products to the United States in terms of nearshoring. That's not often true in much of Latin America. So I'm going to turn to Enrique, but maybe people could focus on what would it take for Latin America not to simply be a source of raw materials, and this is certainly true with China, but actually more finished goods or partially finished goods that would really create more sustainable economic development. But Enrique.
Thank you, Fred. Enrique Perret with the U.S.-Mexico Foundation. So first, I think the biggest missing opportunity from the perspective of the U.S. is its talent and demographics / economics. The demographic bonus for Latin America it's almost passing, right? In Mexico, the media is 29 years old now, right? In the U.S. is 39, in Canada is 41. So everything is about talent now, and we missed a huge opportunity to engage with the Latin American youth on economics, right? Probably there are some countries with the media on 25, 26 still. I think Guatemala is 26, Costa Rica probably 25. There's still an opportunity to engage with this. There's no way to compete for North America, for the US against China or other regions without talent. And the talent is, I mean, in the US there are 10 million right now vacancies, right? And only 5.5 million people looking for a job. So you need these people, right? So that's the first point. And the second point, we all talk about nearshoring, but the real word is reshoring. The U.S. received $250 billion in foreign direct investment last year. And the other year, 2022, it was $200 billion. That's more than the entire region, including Mexico and Brazil, $35 and $60 billion for Brazil. If the U.S. is not able to engage with this reshoring here, the Intel factories in Austin and the Taiwanese semiconductor facility in Arizona with Latin America, in Mexico, we're not expecting to receive a huge semiconductor investment, but we are expecting to be included in the talent and then the supply base on those investments. But ally shoring is the concept that we always talk.
I'm going to go to Jeremy, jump in.
Thank you, Fred. So it's important to recognize that the United States have made a shift in the relationship with Latin America, and it's not It's no longer a form of assistance, but it's a long-term strategic investment. And why? I mean, if Latin America prosper, that's intricately connected with the United States national security. And we are at a stage that Latin America can really help the United States in many, many ways. And we have seen with the American APEP, with the Americas Act and CHIPS Act, that yes, like you said, Enrique, it's mostly reshoring, but there's no possible way that the United States can do that by itself. So it needs reliable partners, and I think we're seeing that in the case of Mexico, Costa Rica, and Panama as members of the ITSI fund, which is the fund that was created by the Chips and Science Act to give funds to partners in the region. So I think that's very encouraging, and yeah, I've seen the shift in the relationship.
What about, since you're from Panama, what about this alternative canal going through Central America? Can you talk to us about that?
Well, I think that's more like a myth, in my opinion. Of course, China will try to exercise influence. The Panama Canal just had a rough several months, in my opinion, with a drought that we had to reduce the number of transits, of daily transits. Not the case anymore, but when these things happen, then China comes out and say, hey, we're gonna do something that's gonna be better and it's gonna be more practical. But we have been operating for more than 100 years, and it's that reliability and resiliency that I think supply chain needs.
Let me ask this question,
Can I just
brief, and then I'm gonna ask another question.
to jump in, which is that very quickly, I mean, the reason the US is Latin America's biggest trading partner is because of the distorting effect of having the Mexican economy on its doorstep. As was rightly said, it's not South America's biggest trading partner. And if you took Mexico out, it's not Latin America's biggest trading partner. That would have been unthinkable at the turn of the century. And I think the big question for Latin American countries is the China relationship a partnership of choice or a partnership of necessity? I think quite a lot of the people in the US and across the wider West think it's a partnership of necessity. I think increasingly, for a lot of Latin American leaders, it's a partnership of choice. And that's why, following on from Isaac's point and others, we need to demonstrate not just that we are interested in extractive industries, but that we're interested in value-added industries. And a lot of what we've been doing in my organization is talking about particularly strengths of the UK and London, but around professional services, around design, around technology, around finance in particular. Can we create partnerships which have meaningful value to countries and companies across Latin America?
You know, we're sitting in a lecture hall. One of the things that people complain about the United States engagement, whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, we're very good at lecturing. We're very good. A friend of mine who was the ambassador to South Africa said, he met the German counterpart, he said, you have a difficult job. You have to talk about democracy, you have to talk about women's rights, you have to talk about minority rights, you have to talk about the environment. All I have to talk about is trade and nothing else. So how do we address that? And one of the things Henrietta said and Enrique said, as I prepared for this panel, you know, we in the US can invest in people's minds and talent. China will invest in the minds of Latin America. So is there a way that we can do more? Would exchanges make a difference? More intellectual exchanges, university exchanges? I'm going to let Dorothy and then Isaac, and then I'll...
This really is like a family table. It's hard to get in because there's just so many great things to hear, though. I wanted to connect what Ramón said about climate and then what was said about foreign direct investment and trade. It's not all that, and I think this gets to your point. And so I want to plug one of the programs in our office, which is about bringing the private sector in to help and assist with growing the local economy, growing entrepreneurship. We have a coalition for climate entrepreneurship, and I just want to put a plug in to the private sector that is here, because what we're looking for is local agency, economic empowerment, around supporting the local ecosystems of entrepreneurship. We have one now in Guatemala. We just announced, Jose Fernandez just announced the one in Guatemala City. We have one in Colombia and one in San Jose, Costa Rica. And basically we are trying to build the ecosystem to support local entrepreneurship who are making impacts on climate and climate action, and yet creating jobs and building the economy around climate solutions. And I think it's really important to think about that local agency and how is the US and how is the private sector supporting that internal economic growth and opportunity.
We have to be careful not to pretend that China is the opposite of the United States and that China has no strings attached relationships. That's very different from how China and the Communist Party works. For example, try to do business with China by being very explicit about, say, the genocide in Xinjiang, a northwest region in China where upwards of 1 million Muslims and others are in concentration camps, or to talk about the authoritarian or dictatorial government. There's a very clear and chilling effect on speech that Beijing has. There's also very strict guidelines and restrictions that it wants when it trades with other countries. And so the idea is not that the US is a perfect partner. There's so many flaws with the way that the US operates. The idea is to understand on a very concrete level the positives and negatives of trading or engaging with Beijing and being very clear-eyed when we're having these conversations.
I think Manuel wanted to speak, and then I'm going to go. And then I'd like you to think about the Belt and Road Initiative. How successful is that, or is there anything we can learn from that?
Yes, thank you, Fred. I just want to go back to your question on how can we move beyond commodities. And that's the case of Costa Rica. We have moved from mines to mines, investing in talent. That has been the key, the secret sauce of a recipe, investing in human talent. More than 70 years ago, we took a bold decision to abolish the army and allocate taxpayers' money to educated people, to buy pencils, not guns, to hire teachers and not generals. So that has been the constant recipe of Costa Rica, to develop our workforce, our talent, to upgrade our human workforce. And now today, very few people know that we have migrated from planting chips to microchips, the arrival of Intel, medical devices, the cluster that we have developed now in semiconductors. We just recently had Secretary Raimondo endorsing a national strategy and roadmaps. That's the way to go. Create value, high value added. For that, you need talent. So I think that Latin America still needs to invest in its people and, of course, uphold the values necessary to attract this FDI, sustainable development, human rights, rule of law. But the recipe, it's easy. Invest in human talent.
Yes.
And then, yes. We'll go 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Jeremy
Briefly.
said something that it needs to be singled out. Our countries in Latin America, our partnership of choice is the United States. If we end up doing business with China at some point, it is out of necessity, not out of choice. And for example, in the DR, we have developed a lot of economic free zones, and those free zones export a lot of material to the U.S. We're doing a lot of medical equipment. We're doing a lot of robotics. We have been growing the free zones. We've become a leader in the free zones in the Americas, and that has come at some point. We have had some tax discussions with the United States because those are tax exemptives, and sometimes we have difficulties with having the U.S. accept those tax exemptions in our countries in order to develop certain areas. But we need those tax exemptions so your companies can come into the Latin America so they can invest in artificial intelligence and robotics and in software. But those are some of the contradictions we sometimes have with the U.S., that they don't want us to give tax exemptions for these fields, and that creates a blockage. But at the end of the day, Jeremy Isaac said something interesting about China. The dialogue with China is not about social issues, it's not about anything. They want to invest in our countries, they want to give us money, they want to give us raw materials, and the only thing they want back is recognition and some kind of a presence in Latin America in order to pressure the U.S. But the problem is that the U.S., every time they deal with us, it's 20 different issues. And I just want to put the example of the Marshall Plan after World War II, where the U.S. went into Europe and did economic first. And that was the way they fought communism. I believe there has to be some kind of Marshall Plan for Latin America.
Thank you, Fred. So we believe a lot of the foreign direct investment will be, or a lot of the investment will be driven by national security now, right? It's not only proximity, it's not because you're neighbors. I think we need, and that's why we created this concept of ally shoring. We We don't believe in the friendly shoring thing. You go to the beach with your friend. You don't go to business with some of your friends or your neighbors. I think we need to pass from partners, neighbors, good friends, to allies, right? If you ask the average American in the US, who are the top 10 allies for the US, there is none Latin American in that list, right? It's Japan, it's England, it's Germany, it's Australia, it's India, it's so on and on. And maybe Mexico is in 12, 13th place, right? So we need to pass, but for that, we need the rules of engagement. Right now, there is a lot of Chinese investment arriving to Mexico, very specific on essential industries, right? Electrical vehicles, telecom, so on and on. The essential industries established by the US during the pandemic. And nobody knows in Mexico if, I mean, you know, you can accept this investment, if this company from China, it's involved in things in China. I mean, nobody knows. So we need the rules of engagement in order to take a position, right? I mean, if a delegation from China comes to an estate in the south of Mexico, that they're desperate for investment, and they're creating 200, 300 jobs in the automotive sector, the governor will say yes. Because he or she don't know the rules of, you know, don't do this because these are the results. So we need to work with the US on those rules of engagement.
Olivia.
Two comments to add, just in the realm of sort of the realism of how. The first is playing the long game really, really matters. So if you think about how long it took for China to become the factory of the world, over the past 25 years, no country, on average, gained more than 1.5 percentage points of export share per year in any good, even as China became the behemoth of manufacturing and electronics. This stuff really takes time, and so both the investment game, but also the way that countries think about the path that they're on needs to be a 10-year, a 20-year sort of plan, not what can I do this year or that year. It really takes time. The other sort of just point of realism I think is important for all of this is human capital is exceedingly important, but without hard infrastructure, none of this goes forward. And if you're in a place like Latin America, which is predominantly urban, but doesn't have the urban infrastructure that actually supports everybody that lives in cities to live productive lives, you're going to be necessarily exceedingly hamstrung. If you don't have the infrastructure to foster trade between Latin American countries, I said this a second ago too, you're also going to be necessarily hamstrung. So I think it's really, really important, even as we think about human capital, even as we think about digital and the excitement of technology going forward, both really important. We can't be blinded to the critical importance also of hard infrastructure.
Fred. Oh, good Lord. I know Henrietta's had her hand up for a while, and then Juan Pablo.
Thank you very much. Just building on that point, you ask about education, and what we did earlier was we brought professors into Latin America and sent students up to the United States, and then we can do it among the states. I think there's enormous potential now because of connectivity. So if we could connect every school in Latin America to the internet, you could have school children talking to each other and connecting, and you could have entrepreneurs connecting. And to Livia's point, one of the things I think we needed, and Enrique's too, was we need something that is more modern than the Marshall Plan. Something that is a big joint initiative that we would do, the United States and Latin America. So maybe it's in food and fuel, maybe, but maybe it's in health and water. But we need an initiative that is big, that we can put academic institutions and entrepreneurs behind so that we all begin to move, that Latin America becomes our ally, friend, neighbor in a way that it's our family. But it needs to be big, it needs to be important, and it needs to have money behind it. The other thing that Dorothy and I were talking about is we don't have financing that covers public and private finance. And so when you are a minister in many of these countries, you do not understand what the financial instruments are the United States has that are available, public and private, and you know this, Fred. So we've got to get some good, simple equations that people understand in public and private sectors in Latin America and the United States, North America, that can really drive this partnership. It needs money.
Juan, Pablo, and then the ambassador.
On the human capital in Latin America, to Eduardo's point, I think that we all agree that it's the enabler. But one thing that we all need to consider and work is how difficult it is for a rural formal employee to have social mobility in our region. Today, with organized crime, with the lack of institution, the value proposition for a frontline employee that they want to be formal, they want to create a better life for the family, it's very difficult. So we need to address that so that we can really start developing upskill, reskill, and I think that that's something that working together, the US and Latin America, we can move faster and provide those conditions so that there's security. We have been working a lot with addressing the root causes of migration in the Northern Triangle. There's a lot of work being done at the PCA, a lot of capital being raised, but the only way for a Guatemalan, Salvador, and Honduras not to leave their countries is if they find security and if there's a path for them and for their families for prosperity.
So Belt and Road Initiative, it has really penetrated. Why? Because we were mentioning before, the policies of the United States with Latin America are there, but the private sector is not at the same speed. So out of necessity, out of giving opportunity to people, and you are all mentioning infrastructure. Who's building the infrastructure? Then it's kind of difficult to compete if China's state-owned companies are fast in deploying the infrastructure required. So one of the things that I mentioned the other day in the Appropriations Committee in Washington was you have a number of tools in your toolbox that you're not using, like DFC. For example, countries like...
Let the audience know, we're going to try and do as few acronyms as possible.
Okay, so this is a...
This is a test to see if the ambassador is good on this.
Very good, very good. Finance Corporation, Development Finance Corporation. So what happens is that countries like Panama and other upper income countries really have the necessity of building infrastructure, and it can't be that you can't use that assistance just because of that, and you have to take into consideration other characteristics like inequality. And so I think I raise an alarm there, and hopefully in next year in the reauthorization they can include countries like Panama. I think Uruguay has the same case, Chile. But we really need to get something going in the private sector. U.S. has to, we need to have that that influence of the United States, because the speed of China, it's overpowering us.
Okay, hold on.
If I may, I want to give
I got
an
two on this
example.
side, then I'll pivot back.
I want to give an example of how sometimes the right hand in the U.S. doesn't know what the left hand is doing.
I'm shocked to hear that. Shocked. Not surprised, just shocked.
In 2020, when the new administration in the DR went into office, President Abinader prohibited Chinese investment in infrastructure. That we did that as an alliance to the states. They wanted to invest. I'm sorry. They wanted to invest in airports and in docks. And let me just say, the Dominican Republic has more air connectivity with the states than what Brazil, Chile, and Argentina does, because of our proximity. So 3 months after we do that, per our alliance to the states, comes the pandemic. And when the pandemic comes in, we want to buy the vaccines. We do a contract with Pfizer, and we pay the vaccines in advance. Then Pfizer says, we can't supply you because we have to supply the US market first. And we were left without vaccines. China donated all the vaccines, and we vaccinated the DR, which lives off tourism. So the pandemic was not any joke to us, because without tourism, our economy doesn't work. So we needed to vaccinate our people, so we needed to reinstate tourism. And we were just left, after we blocked Chinese investment in our infrastructure, the US blocked the vaccines coming into the DR. So that gives you an example of how we need to restart our partnership, because we are, most of us, our second biggest city in the DR is New York City. We have over 1 million Dominicans in New York. So we are pro-US. Any way you look at it, we're pro-US. But sometimes the US isn't pro-Latin America.
I'm going to let Isaac go. I'm going to have another question. We've got about 15 minutes left. We're going to ask some questions of the audience. You have a QR code, so you can just begin to think about that. But Isaac.
Thank you. So on Olivia's point, these things take time. We have to understand there's been a radical shift in the relationship between the United States and China, and what used to be appropriate with partnering with Chinese entities is no longer appropriate from the US, either regulatorily or from a public relations perspective or from a government procurement perspective. And I think it's very important.
What do you mean by that, to be specific, so people understand?
So let's say there's a major US consulting company that might be represented on this panel that used to work with the Chinese Communist Party and then got a lot of public criticism for working with the Chinese Communist Party. Or the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which was passed almost unanimously in the Senate and the House, which creates what's called a rebuttable presumption, which means that anything that's coming from Xinjiang into the United States is assumed to have been made with forced labor, unless the company can explicitly prove that it wasn't otherwise. Xinjiang was responsible for roughly 20% of the world's cotton. The largest export from Xinjiang to the United States today is the precursors for amino acids. And so pharmaceutical companies are scrambling to demonstrate that they're not importing drug precursors made potentially from forced labor. What we need to be very clear on, to Enrique's point, is what are the rules? What kind of companies can you work with? Khrushchev, about 50 years ago, complained to JFK that the United States should stop selling buttons to the Soviet Union because soldiers were using them to hold up their trousers to better fire Kalashnikovs at American soldiers. Is that what we should do with China? Can we partner with the Chinese Communist Party, or can we not? We need to have a very public debate and have very explicit rules of engagement and rules of the road so that we know what we can and can't do.
Enrique and then Manuel.
On that point, and it's for Mexico, so 99% of the Chinese investment in Mexico is to produce a good that is coming to the US, right? So it's like, well, this doesn't have logic, right? You are not allowing me for China to invest in Mexico, but it's your companies buying those goods in Mexico and then crossing the border. So I think we need to work on that. But just, some things are more difficult than others. I think, just to return to Henrietta's point on education, professional and educational exchange, for example, right now between the US and Latin America. In the case of Mexico, we have 14,000 Mexicans studying in the US. That is nothing. There are only 2,000 Americans studying in Mexico. That is nothing. Compared to China, China has more than 200,000 Chinese students right now in US universities. So that's more than the entire Latin American students coming from Latin America, not the Hispanics living here. And that's something that we can work. It's basically scholarships, right? It's basically to create a narrative on universities like this, to go to Mexico, to go to Costa Rica. I think Costa Rica is the country that is attracting more students from the US. But I think we can change that. In a program 2 years, three years from now, Mexico can have 20, 30,000 students in the US. So those are things that we can change.
Manuel?
Just quickly,
I
15
love that
seconds
word
on
quickly.
15 seconds on infrastructure. Yes, there is a big need of hard infrastructure projects in Latin America. Yes, China has a recipe to fill the financing gaps to develop this infrastructure. However, we must be very clear that whatever sort of investment and financial contribution to develop this hardware infrastructure must not undermine our sovereignty, must not undermine our values, our environmental labor standards, and of course respect the public procurement standards that we have set forth.
Can I just, my final and quick remarks, which is to pick up, because it's been picked up by a few, about this necessity versus choice point I introduced. I think it's both. And I think the necessity point is a big challenge for the US and for European countries as well. Belt and Road has filled a gap that is clearly not being filled by the US. And British companies and others are woefully negligent about Latin America, in my view. I mean, the risk of sounding critical about US, I think Europe is much worse. Of course, it's not in the same landmass, but the wider West has not given Latin America as many investment opportunities as I think it could have done, and has left a void for China to step into. But I think we're also pulling a punch if we say there's no element of choice. I accept it may not be for DomRep and other countries. There are differences from one country to another. But across Latin America, quite often you see the US as the big brother. You admire your big brother, you look up to your big brother, but at the same time you resent how overbearing your big brother sometimes is. And along comes another friend who appears to have all the attributes of a big brother without all of the bad overbearing bits. And I think that is seductive for some countries in Latin America, not being lectured to by the US the whole time. And what is BRICS expansion? What is the condoning of what Russians are doing in Ukraine if it's not, soft peddling on the choice element of that necessity versus choice equation? So I don't think it's quite as straightforward as just saying it's all necessity. I think both parts of that equation come into play. US and the West need to do more on the necessity part, but I think Latin American countries in some cases need to have their eyes wide open on the choice part as well.
I'm going to try and do a little summation. One of the things I heard here is an inconsistency about U.S. policy. So, and partly, I'm speaking not just to the panelists, but to the audience. There are things that all of us can do to change this dynamic. This is not just a random group of people who happen to just show up on the University of Miami campus today. So you all have a way and know people, both in your companies, both in government, in the private sector, the public sector, to talk about that consistency that we heard, and a greater investment in talent. As I said when I prepared for this, we do a much better job of investing in the minds of people in Latin America, and let China invest in the minds of Latin America. We can win that battle. We're not going to win the other battle. And I would say one thing I thought about, Enrique, when I traveled with you to Mexico in 2019, and it was before USMCA, U.S.-Mexican-Canada agreement. Countries in Latin America, and I'm going to go out on a limb. This is a personal view. I think Mexico and Canada made a mistake with NAFTA, where they never made their case to the American people and to American around the country. So, particularly to those who represent other countries here, it's important for you to speak to governors, mayors, members of Congress, policymakers about how important this relationship is, because I think it was too easy for something like NAFTA to be simply characterized as sucking jobs out of the United States and not realizing the value that NAFTA and hopefully USMCA, and if we go to an Americas Act where other countries could have basically joined USMCA, policymakers, companies, different representatives from Latin America need to make that case to the American public and find compelling ways to do so. And frankly, that would go a long way to creating those kind of allies that we talked about. So I have a couple of questions for the audience. You have in front of you a QR code. I'm going to turn this device on, and this will, I am going to turn this, there we go. So we have 3 questions. Question 1. Due to the tumultuous economic rivalry between the U.S. and China, Latin America should prioritize which of the following to achieve economic stability. Oh my God, you've already voted. I'll let the voting continue. Half of you have voted. Don't be shy. Okay. We'll go to the clearly all of the above. That's kind of the easy answer. But all of the above, but if I was to prioritize understanding and adopting existing emerging trade dynamics and constantly adapting to evolving manufacturing landscape. Let's go to the next question. Which new frontiers of manufacturing are most viable in creating economic stability in Latin America? Okay. So 1 and 3 are certainly number one, nearshoring opportunities. I think that we've seen that in Costa Rica. We've seen that in parts of the region. I will tell you, a friend of mine lives here in Miami. His son needed tutoring, and he found the best tutoring was, frankly, online with a woman in El Salvador. That was half the price of an American tutor and a much better quality. So there are those kind of opportunities that, frankly, Zoom and the pandemic has brought to us. Let me go to the last question. You're already ahead of me. Is the Latin American economy currently in a position to withstand continued trade tensions and geopolitical shifts? Okay, well, I think it's clear no is the answer, which is okay. That provides a clear path and an opportunity to greater engagement, I think, as Jeremy said, both with the UK, EU, the United States, and not be simply dependent on one somewhat unreliable source. So we've got, I can't believe it, 3 minutes left with the 12 of us here. Is there anything quickly that we have left out that somebody has a burning desire to share that we have not yet shared with the audience?
I'll say one thing, and that is that I just want to give an example of the financial tools that Henrietta was talking about. The IDB just recently...
What's that stand for?
Oh, Inter-American Development Bank.
Thank you.
Is partnering under the American Partnership for Economic Economic Prosperity, and currently has under assessment now $3 billion in projects for investment around infrastructure, nearshoring in Latin America, so and the Caribbean. I just wanted to end on that good news that there are projects in the pipeline now, and that the awareness of these financial tools and these mixed financing abilities are really important to making sure that, you know, U.S. investment.
Fred, I just want to make a final comment. The relationship of the United States, and many times I hear that, what is the U.S. policy for Latin America? And it should not be for Latin America. It should be a policy with Latin America, because as a continent, we need to work as a bloc in order to compete. And I think that's something that we need to work on.
I agree with what you said on the narrative. I think Mexico and Canada did a huge mistake just leaving this in autopilot for 25 years. We need to work on that narrative with media in the U.S. It's incredible. In 2016, that candidate Trump was complaining about $60 billion deficit with Mexico. Right now, it's $153 billion in deficit through less than a decade. So we are super afraid of that. But it's not a deficit. It's in favor of the U.S. Every expert from Latin America to the U.S. has a lot of U.S. content. In the case of Mexico, it's 45 cents out of each dollar that we export. It already has products from the U.S., and I know is the case from it. Let's take the opportunity of the World Cup in 2026 to create a new message there.
Well, thank you. I want to just thank our panelists. I think everybody got their more than 2 cents in. And most importantly, I think what you said, Enrique, that is, we cannot leave this on autopilot the way it was with NAFTA for 25 years. It's going to take much more engagement from people at the table here, people in the audience, people who are watching from home or their offices, to make this a much more robust and richer engagement than we've had in the past. And I think the opportunity is here. So let me just thank the panelists, thank our audience for being so diligent in listening, and wish you the rest of a great conference.
Yeah.